Visible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll be starting in a few seconds. Just to be clear, I'll be taking POIs through the chat. I'll be taking you up in like the fourth or the fifth minute. Setting up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Patriarchy works in insidious ways, and the creation of, say, people in the society who believe that their relationships, romantic relationships, are beyond redemption is probably the worst demonstration of what it has done to our society. Before I begin, a couple of clarifications, because I think that opposition might take this debate to the wrong side. There are two definitions of incels. Like there's like incel that exclusively applies to men, the more mainstream versions of incel, and then there's femcel, right? What does this difference entail? Incels, like the male version of incels, are aggrieved on the basis of perpetual rejections from women, which means like they do feel they are unattractive, but their unattractiveness is largely based on the fact of value. They're not validated by women, right? This is primarily a consequence of adopting, like, say, alt-right tendencies, probably problems in their value systems, probably their own inadequacies where they are rejected by women, but then they end up blaming the woke movement and as a consequence get radicalized by alt-right. In majority of cases, these incels are a group of people with self-inflicted grievances determined primarily by actions within their own control, like bad hygiene, bad ideals, whatnot. There are a few reasons why we support femcels, right? Because notice, we think that under our side, femcels are byproducts of patriarchy. When you say byproducts, you essentially mean the way patriarchy has damaged the self-esteem of women, and they are probably the worst victims. Patriarchy perpetuates the idea of, like, say, conventional attractiveness through beauty industry, through like regular conversations where we talk about bodies, like body image and whatnot, right? Which is like there are various ways that are culturally and socially infused that make women feel inadequate. We think this is also further worsened because capitalism also works in the same way, right? The way beauty industry promotes itself, the way, say, conventional attractiveness is prioritized in all shapes and forms. Conventionally attractive people are given more agencies and more opportunities in society, means that these women essentially are more likely to be worse off, because notice these femcels exclusively tend to be people who are not within the conventional norms, but secondly, they also tend to be people with disability or things that they cannot really control, or they're attractive in a way that has been conditioned to them by like patriarchy when they are growing up, right? What do I mean by this? We think that involuntary celibacy is in all essences a trauma response, right? When I say it's a trauma response, we think we internalize the fact that we are like involuntarily celibate, the point at which society makes us feel this way. So there's a high likelihood that these women were bullied when they were kids. These women don't really have a good environment in their houses, wherefore their like self-esteem is something that is controlled by, like, say, other people in society. They grew up without any good support structure or without any women to look up to in their proximity, which means that all they had was their resentment against misogyny and patriarchy, and they radicalized within their own confines because they did not really have people that they could actually rely on. So these problems that these women experience, like unreasonable beauty standards, misogyny, inherent like patriarchal power structures that denies them opportunity in the society and the workplace, these are not self-inflicted, but a reflection of how male-dominated society actively enforces standards that these women cannot meet, such as like what is good for the male gaze and how that's prioritized by almost all media throughout the world. Because notice that op can argue on, oh, the world is gradually liberalizing. We don't really think that these women exist on these liberal spheres, but rather they exist in spheres where liberalism does not really have that reach, right? These women exist in areas that have like less feminists, probably that probably tend to be more conservative, or they grew up in conditions that prioritized anti-feminism, right? So these women are often isolated and alienated because of these standards. So not only does this negatively affect their ability to have romantic relationships, it also actively limits the platonic relationships that they can have. So they don't really have friends that they can count on, friends that make them feel attractive, friends that can boost their self-esteem. So supporting these women necessitates better conversations, because these norms like feminist movements, like say being against like male gaze, dismantling the beauty standards set by patriarchy and capitalism, probably give these women more agency, and it gives them an out from necessarily radicalizing element and implicit incel movements. Because notice, the status quo is that these women form echo chambers because they are radicalized, and they exist within, say, subreddits, they exist within like forums where they are around women who have had similar experiences, women with the same level of self-esteem, and they are more likely to like drop into the doomer void where they think that their existence in the society, their beauty is beyond redemption. The weighing here is that, first, I've already told you, there is perpetuation of beauty standards in most places. Second, liberal movements prioritize people who are more popular. As a consequence, attractive people, the way Emma Watson is given a lot of space, the way a lot of, like, say, conventionally attractive celebrities who are also feminists occupy a lot of space, right? And it's further worse. And notice Prop needs to engage with this frame, is because the world is gradually becoming smaller. Online dating is a thing. These women feel like more alienated because they don't really get matches, probably they don't really have avenues to date other people, they don't have other men who like them, and as a consequence all they have resentment against their own existence, and as a consequence they radicalize. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Could you please clarify,
Yeah.
how does this support translate and how does the support manifest? What are you doing with the support? Are you telling them, yay, you're cool?
Coming to that. What does our counterfactual look like? We think under our side, feminist movements support femcel groups. We think we welcome femcels into the general movement. We give them spaces, similar to the way, say, alt-right talks about the problems of incest by saying that, oh, these are problems faced by young men. Probably we are going to make conversations around femcels just as mainstream, because the radicalization is actually growing. More and more women are feeling alienated by the minute. Second, we form connections with them in the form of acquaintanceships and friends, and have them attend feminist rallies and protests where they can productively channel their anger and frustration, and they can get like suited with like better support structures who are going to make them feel attractive, who are probably going to change their thought process. So there will be a meeting in the middle, because if your claim would be that they're radicalized, the feminist movement isn't going to suddenly become like hyper radical, and feminists aren't suddenly going to be like chill activists, right? But this might look like feminist movements more actively focusing to dismantle beauty norms as a public target, and femcels being able to accept that their problems are a reflection of patriarchy, specifically opposed to pretty women, also pretty women who might have also bullied them when they were growing up. So under your side, probably they don't really have those avenues. As a consequence, they radicalize more. They're left to the confines of the status quo. They become more depressed. We lift them out of that depression. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and invite the leader for opposition to begin the case side approach.
Am I clearly audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, just give me 30 seconds to gather my notes. Pia is exclusively in the chat. If I have time, I'll ask for it at that point. Yeah, 30 seconds. Okay, assuming I'm still audible, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, the world for far too long has denied women their happiness, their right to satisfaction, and tried to put limits and constraints on it. This has extended even into the realms of romantic relationships and sexual pleasures. Before I move on to direct responses to side of government, I'll first give you a characterization of what romantic relationships look like in status quo. Understand the fact that there's an inherent lack of inclusivity in romantic relationships. Why? Because in order to get into those relationships, you have to fulfill certain societal standards. There are beauty standards on how your body must look like, how you as an individual might look like, or how you should act in bed, etc., etc. You must cater to body pleasure, have no body hair, and these arbitrary gender norms that should be prioritized specifically from the female point of view if you are to be considered able enough to get into a relationship. Then there are arbitrary gender norms that bind you, that women should stay virgin till marriage or before marriage, which again decreases the propensity or decreases the chance a woman has to get into a relationship in the first place. What does this do? The second reason to that is, even if you get into a relationship, there are the narratives dictated by porn films, social media memes have all made a social understanding of relationships being structured mostly around sexually satisfying male, and hence in that relationship females are still unable to get the pleasure. Female orgasm is not prioritized and their pleasure takes a backseat compared to the male counterpart. The two reasoning and these two cases of framing that I give you is specifically important because what this tells you is there a problem of involuntary celibacy, which means people have to practice celibacy even when they don't want to because they have no other alternative. This is something side government clearly misses out on, and this is something we'll move on to why feminist movements should not relate with and why we need to focus on solving involuntary celibacy as the main problem, because people who voluntarily want to buy into celibacy can go ahead and do that through their agency. But it's the people who are suffering the problem of involuntary celibacy, and we believe when feminist movement chooses to associate with the femcels, this problem is made inherently worse. Why? Because when you opt into the structure, when feminist movement goes and actively support them, you opt into the structure that prioritizes male pleasure, where you say that sex is the male gaze, and beauty standards continue to curtail in government's paradigm just because of the fact now you have actively chosen to relate with the fact. Insofar they never go ahead and mechanize in their speech how they want to bring about this change, in understanding narratives or the beliefs that exist in the status quo. They're never able to achieve this aim and are less likely to have a lesser propensity to do it on their side of the house. First argument, how support manifests in normalizations and what is this issue? Understand the fact that when you go ahead and support this particular femcel, the feminist movement actually helps normalizing the problem of involuntary celibacy, where you believe that it's okay for world to be structured around sexual pleasures from the male point of view. You never tackle the problem of women issues, or you never tackle the issues of how women are underrepresented when it comes to talking about their pleasures, or when it comes to talking about how they want their pleasures to look like in a relationship. Because these narratives or these norms are not created by rallies or the feminist movement rallies. These are dictated by media. These are dictated by what is popularized in the mainstream media, or how society perceives this relationship to be. It's not about letting out your own personal beliefs within a closed group or sharing your experiences. It's more about whether society starts accepting the new narrative. Unless that happens, most women are locked out of achieving this change side government wants to do. Second of all, what does involuntarily mean? Involuntary means that these people are coerced into being celibate or practice celibacy. And as the feminist movement, it has a principal obligation where it wants to maximize choice and individual interest for all female actors involved. Insofar that is not being practiced in this paradigm, we believe that going ahead and associating with femcels is essentially in violation or in contradiction with what the feminist movement stands on its goal, which is to maximize choice and agency for female actors involved. Okay. Second of all, argument 2, what happens on our side of the house? We allow you to reclaim and redefine female pleasure. All women deserve sexual pleasure, and they get to define what this looks like because it's a subjective choice. It's not for an arbitrary metric to decide what classifies as pleasure for you or not. What pleases them is what is important in this debate, and we want to achieve a world where female pleasure and body positivity both exist, and that they aim to have a better relationship in our part of the house, and they are not pushed to be celibate. This is exclusively happening on our side of the house, because insofar when you don't support, you have to explain why they exist or if they shouldn't exist. Structures that push women to be celibate involuntarily should be mitigated. How can we do that? A, we can continue to work with media houses such as drive female pleasure in porn films, mainstream media, or talk about it in popular podcasts. This looks like when you allow more female directors to direct porn films or media films centered around female pleasure, which allows society to change their opinion or start talking about them or start looking at relationships in a different way. Look at it in an example. Imagine if the scene in Friends where Monica talks about the 7 places of pleasure, it was more transparent and more clear and more clearly flushed out to people, so people understood what they were inherently talking about. So insofar when movements work by individually tackling this problem, by changing media narratives and media representatives of the same, there's an inherent greater propensity to change the outlook on what relationships look like in the mainstream society. Insofar if you're able to change that, there's a greater propensity that you start being accepted for what you are, and then you can get into the sexual relationship part, get into the relationships as you like, thus stopping the problem of involuntary celibacy. Second of all, insofar what happens is the sour relationship part of is due to the lack of pleasure. When men start also understanding the fact that when you talk about female pleasure, you also have an inherent ability to derive more pleasure in the relationship for both partners, men also have an incentive to talk about it more. Rather than when you structure it as a movement, only talking it from the context of females, there's lesser propensity to have men as an actor in their paradigm of the house who also work towards bettering the situation or put in effort into talking about how involuntary celibacy as a problem must be curtailed. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks. I thank the speaker for that speech. I invite the TPM to continue the case for side proposition. Just give me 1 second to change the slides.
Hi, can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Sorry, Chair, are you ready as well?
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right,
now
all right.
I'm ready.
The dictionary definition of word involuntary is that they don't want it. So they don't want celibacy, but they are forced to be in that situation because of the ongoing rejections of them. So not exactly sure how side opposition goes from these people who don't want to celibate, actually enforcing norms that go against female pleasure in feminism. Our case is different. We say that a lot of these femcels and the people within those kind of femcels are the product of societal oppression, most directly through patriarchy. Because notice that the level and the way in which females perceive pleasure is connected to male gaze. That is to mean the selection process, the way in which you get access to opportunities is all determined by how a man perceives your relationship with you. If the sense of social validation is dependent on that, and a lot of people are not getting access to that, I'm not exactly sure as to why feminist movement should alienate these actors who actually represent the brunt of effect of patriarchy that these people face. Notice that these people have faced a lot of frustration. There are 2 types of frustration that they face. One, from general societal superficial men who are likely to reject them in many instances based on arbitrary and unreasonable state of beauty standards, like we and side opposition symmetrically assert, like asymmetrically assert. As the next thing to importantly prioritize is they also don't like other women who are able to benefit from these kind of pleasures. That is to mean people who are able to use this as a way to gain higher traction and support in mainstream politics. This looks like people like Taylor Swift and Emma Watson getting mainstream power in social media and also ways in which feminist movement dictates discourse. If that is so, these people don't see themselves and the issues represented on this kind of discourse, because a person who would otherwise not get rejected or otherwise not probably suffer this kind of harms are running this kind of movement. We think that the representation of the issues that these women face is a more mainstream cause for a feminist movement for them to ever stay relevant to a large majority of people, because the issues that femcels face in a spectrum is faced by other women as well. Maybe they face the worst kind of harms because of the very involuntary, because that they are forced into certain kind of circumstances. This is not a reason to just ignore them and not support the kind of cause that they have. I think we should be able to envision a world without beauty standards, envision a world where they don't have to feel inadequate, but also envision a world where they have support, and which is important for them not to get de-radicalized. A few things that we want to prioritize here straight out of the front. First thing is, their case is about redefining female pleasure. Their analysis is, we don't want celibacy. The same thing is true for these people. They don't want celibacy as well. The idea here is, in so many situations, women and people aren't able to problematize the issue of atrocities that were committed against women in the case of relationship in a degree that is necessary. For example, we see that it is an issue that is a passing issue, we should care about it, but not how so much. So on these kind of situations where these people have been frustrated for far too long because of the male gaze, these people want certain things they don't get in the society, a lot of the social validation is dependent on the kind of relationships that you are able to engage. We are able to get that anger and frustration on the mainstream, where we are actually able to notice that there are people who are affected by this much worse. This shifts the Overton window in a way that we are more able to accept more moderate demands from feminists, but also able to see these problems in a more direct fashion. This is better, because notice that radicalization and any kind of action from these kind of people is a continued process. That is to mean they feel the brunt of expression, anger, and frustration over time, and this leads to other things that might lead to radicalization. In our side, we are giving them some kind of platform so that they don't have to go into insidious channels like Reddit and then perpetuate the kind of information that they do there, which might be unmoderated and that is likely to be harmed. The reason for this is we have in mainstream discourse, we have more channels for criticism, we have more channels for fruitful engagement, we also give them support, and that is why they have no need to go out into this kind of situation. It's important to notice what kind of women side opposition is able to ignore in their side. We told you these women are burned or probably don't have ability to get those conventional beauty standards. This means probably we are also talking about people who don't have money to mitigate their harms or probably mitigate the certain problems that they perceive to be problems within their beauty standards. That is to mean they are unable to exist in a society with a fully functioning relationship. But we also live in a world where Tinder has become more mainstream in regards to how people see relationship, where people just swipe based on how you look or the appearance that you have. We also have more ongoing popularity about more powerful and beautiful people in terms of celebrities. They are getting more traction, getting more benefits. And a lot of these things are also able to sideline the issues that these people face, because notice that when relationship becomes easily available to so many people are not going to care. And the recognition of this means that a lot of the people are more likely to see these women as also important part of this kind of movement. The response from people is more likely to go to them, probably to know about the issues, try to dismantle the issues that carve patriarchy in the current situation. I'll take you, POI.
Stop strawmanning the debate. Both sides already agree that women are pushed to be femcels because of societal structures. Then please explain, why are you more likely than our side to get the impacts of changing these structures and reinterpreting what female pleasure looks like?
All right, so okay, your analysis here is that we'll have more normalization of involuntary celibacy on your straight side. I don't know how that comes by, because their need or their demand is going against involuntary celibacy. So I'm not sure you have proven your point here. The second thing is normalization is a large step away because these people have been underrepresented for far too long. If anything, we give them position in some diverse female spectrum where they at least get some voice instead of going out and ranting out on Reddit. The benefit here is we are more able to communicate the issues that these people face, make it some kind of feminist agendas. The important benefit is where are they better off? Because notice that these women, both sides agree, are harmed by the society. In your side, you do nothing for them. That is the comparative that you have to deal with. On our side, we bring them to certain platforms where they get a voice. This is better because the reason as to why they feel frustrated is in addition to not getting relationships and the economic and romantic benefits that they can get, which are engineered through social narratives about connections and a lot of other things. On our side, they at least get to voice out their anger and frustration, which is better for feminist movement because we can weaponize that as a rallying cry against patriarchy. We can use these stories. We can also use that to shift the discourse in our favor. The benefit on our side is that we have more people supporting our movement, but also we risk alienating people who are facing the worst forms of harms from patriarchy. Very proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech, and invite the deputy leader for opposition to continue the next side opposition.
All right. Am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that the Gov side has made this debate extremely messy because they don't know what support means. Support means two things which they necessarily had to deal with. A, validate the idea that involuntary celibacy is okay to be had in society. That's what support means, right? The moment you support femcels, you support the idea of involuntary celibacy because you say that that's okay to be in a society, and we understand that. But secondly, and more importantly, the second thing which they say, we both sides agree that there's societal operation which has caused this woman to be femcels, and that's absolutely okay. Here is the difference. How do femcels see this societal operation to be? They don't see it as a narrative where society is bad, and that's why they want to fight off this societal narrative as a whole. What they see is that we are inherently ugly. We necessarily don't have sex, or necessarily can't have it, or can't have meaningful relationships because we are just good, not enough. And that is what these femcels believe in. I'll prove to you later why that is tremendously harmful of it. What is Gov's mechanization there? Gov mechanization is that, hey, we want to support these people, we want to give them platform, and that will solve beauty standards and also multitudes of reasons why that's likely to be true. A, you're principally inconsistent. The moment you support this, right? What happens then is that you're necessarily validating the experiences of being in a situation where it is involuntary. Why this is tremendously bad? Because you validate the idea of male gaze and you say that, hey, you validate the idea that you necessarily need to be looked upon for your own pleasure by the perspective of a male POV. I think at that point of paradigm, you're necessarily not able to type the idea of what female pleasure literally means, right? Which is to say things like from media and so on, where you support things like female writers and female directors who actually direct movies and talk about what female pleasure can look like. All of those narratives gets lost. But secondly, and more importantly, you cannibalize everything which they want to stand for, right? Because here is the thing, the moment you give platform to femcels, they don't say that we don't get partners because society has beauty standards. They say that we don't get partners because we are just ugly, and that's absolutely okay. Some of us would be ugly, and that's absolutely fine. We have a problem with that because this sets beauty standards again, because it tries to define women into beauty / ugly kind of a comparative, and that's problematic because the platform which they generally want to give allows that narrative to be created. Why that is harmful then? Because in our world, we do not support femcels because we think that it cannibalizes our pressure to change things like beauty standards, to push for female pleasure and so on. How do we do this, and why do they cannibalize that, right? I think at one point of time, the first idea here is really simple. The reason why we have to set up beauty standards is by saying that it's absolutely not okay for anyone to be involuntary. They support that, they say that sometimes it's okay because society has done for you and they give this platform. The problem with that is, even if they have the best intentions in their mind, all of it gets lost in translation, right? Which means that on the face value itself, it looks like the feminist movement is validating experiences which are involuntary. I think at that point of time, it's problematic. So what is the prioritization of this debate then it looks like? Where do you prioritize more agency for women? We think we prioritize more agency at a point of which you are directly able to attack the beauty standards and the idea of female pleasure. How do we do this? We control things in media. We necessarily push ad campaigns to promote things like what beauty standards can look like. This look like Dove ads where they necessarily hire back actresses and back models to redefine beauty standards and so on. You cannot reclaim and redefine the same things at the same point of time when femcels come up and say that some of us are going to be ugly every single freaking time. I think at that point of paradigm, your both narratives necessarily counteract with each other. You cannot get both changed at that point of paradigm, right? They completely miss the comparative of what support means. But before that, POI.
So the info slide says that these women often are excluded, and they know they are because of beauty standards and misogyny. They're not going to call other people ugly. They recognize the patriarchy at work. You have to debate the motion, guys. Just because you didn't read the info slide doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
They don't read the info slide, right? They had to explain to me why femcels believe that the idea of being ugly is a societal standard, or it's inherently they're supposed to be ugly. They just realize that they are ugly. I'm extremely unsure why they think that A, it is a societal operation, but two, even if they think that it's just natural and cannot be changed. That's what femcels means, guys. There's a difference between normal feminists and femcels. Femcels have necessarily internalized that bias. That's what makes them femcels. Otherwise, this debate is about feminists. This debate has no comparative then. Just broken motion then, right? I think at that point of paradigm, they necessarily lose out on the comparative. How do we get changed? Then there are multitudes of reasons, right? One, you're never able to reclaim what male pleasure necessarily looks like, and never able to teach male what female pleasure can look like, right? That can only happen in our paradigm at a point of which you try to change those structures directly. And why this is tremendously important, we think that it creates a world where you can necessarily prioritize what gives more women pleasure, but also more importantly, you create a world where beauty standards are extremely lesser. We think that it helps because it allows us to decrease the societal operation government so wants to talk about. This allows involuntary celibacy to naturally decrease because there is no involuntary force societal factors which necessarily cause this. For all of those reasons, we are more likely to get change. What is the comparative then, right? One, in terms of consistency, we think that we give just more agency to people because this allows people to directly talk about beauty standards, and that's something which necessarily has more impacts throughout the all, because we think that the femcel movement necessarily cannibalizes that. But secondly, and more importantly, right, the fact that it validates involuntary actions necessarily means that feminist movement stands for something which is a lack of agency in and of itself. We think at that point of paradigm, it necessarily shows and questions the feminist movement as a whole, and it loses traction because it looks tremendously weaker. Because the feminist movement generally, for all the four ways, necessarily stands for the idea of more agency. We necessarily think that when it's more involuntary, it goes directly against the feminist principle. But thirdly, and more importantly, it helps more women in the future as well, because if being femcel is a problem and we don't want a world where we have femcels, we have way lesser femcels in the future itself, right? At a point of which we're able to directly target beauty standards and disallowing that movement to get cannibalized. That means that we help more future generations. But fourthly, right, we think these ideas of like what female pleasure looks like, or the idea of sex education or beauty standards, is just way more pervasive in developing countries. These countries necessarily watch what Western countries do. Their movie culture and movie industry is directly dependent upon what Hollywood does, and they necessarily control trends and so on, right? For all of those reasons, we help just more vulnerable women living in more vulnerable societies, especially rural, semi-rural, and urban areas in countries like India, South Africa, and so on, right? But fourthly, fifthly, and more importantly, we just think now utilitarian meeting within this as well, because we are just more numerate to help more amount of women, right? And because of the fact that sixthly, we just don't impact this other way. So look at this way, right? The moment you support femcels, these women who acknowledge things like, hey, some women inherently don't have the agency to go around, and you necessarily validate the idea of involuntariness. This attacks every single other thing feminism stands for in terms of agency to choose your jobs, agency to work for you. I think all of those women are directly harmed at a point at which you are principally inconsistent. But even if you aren't, and somehow GovWhip is able to show you a nuance of it, this nuance gets lost in translation at a point at which conservatives get to harp upon what feminists are doing in terms of femcels and necessarily show you that principal inconsistencies, which means that you lose out the people on the fringes about the feminist movement as well. So for all of those reasons, proud to oppose.
I find the speaker for that speech and invite the government whip into the substantive part of the
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Right, I'd like my POIs to chat specifically. Right, starting in 3, 2, 1. They didn't read the motion. The motion isn't about supporting the femcel movement. It's about supporting femcels. That is, individuals who are associated with the femcel movement, but not the movement itself. We were very clear at first to clarify this. We told you the reason femcels exist is because of patriarchal norms that have actively affected the outcomes they're able to achieve in life and actively influence the connections they could have formed otherwise. We also told you they were radicalized because they go to individual platforms where anonymity exists, like Reddit or like some random Tumblr thread, where other people who have the same experiences collectivize and talk about the same issues over and over again, where you buy into it. This doesn't mean they think they're ugly. This means, and this is supported by the info side, by the way, because it says, often because of beauty standards and misogyny. So beauty standards means they recognize conventionally they're not attractive. But misogyny necessarily implies their acceptance of the existence of a systemic oppression against women as a whole, because that's what misogyny is. It isn't accepting that you are ugly. It's accepting that what is beautiful and what is ugly is coded by the men that dictate society. That is incredibly important, because Op just assumes the info side doesn't exist, assumes the motion is something other than it is, and then argues about like us not debating the motion accurately. No, read both of those things properly, and then you can, I don't know, try and recuperate somehow at Op Whip. I want to talk about some other things DLO said, and I'm going to be very clear here. The first thing they say is, for some reason, government is trying to have more incels. We're trying to create more involuntary celibates within the feminist movement. No, like I said earlier, we support individuals. We told you at Nishan, you didn't respond at LO, you buy that premise. We told you again at Srijan, and your rejection is literally just saying, we didn't say that, guys. We were very clear about what we support and how we support these things. You have to debate the mechanisms, not the made-up claims that are in your head, what you made in case. But the second response is, they recognize patriarchy. So the reason they are involuntary celibates isn't because, they're not having sex because they think they're not good enough. They're not having sex because they recognize the reason they are not good enough is a systemic problem caused by the existence of patriarchal forces in society that decide who looks attractive, how attractive, and what happens if you aren't attractive. That's the important nuance they missed in this round. Second thing about principle and consistency. Guys, read the info slide. We're not saying we're going to support we're not supporting the femcel movement. We're also not against female pleasure. This is incredibly important. All of the benefits they want to claim are symmetric under government as well. That is to say, at no point in time where do we accept the femcels, these individuals that we want to recuperate, and somehow go against the very things we're trying to help them solve, right? So beauty norms, the fact that the male directors dictate what looks attractive, what looks sexy, and how other people in society view the same thing are things we are actively against. In fact, in our impact and in our counterfact, we told you very specifically, the way the movement might change to accommodate these women is to specifically be against these sort of things to a greater capacity, right? So if we're against beauty norms as a whole, it's likely to be the case that we are also principally consistent with doing away with the male gaze entirely, which is what the crux of opposition's case is. So yes, you have impacts. They're just very, very symmetric, and you don't have anything else. I've beaten you here. I have 3.5 minutes, so I'm going to beat you a bit more. The third thing is, generally speaking, they are more aware of what's happening because of, one, the info side verifying it, but also us mechanizing exactly what it means to be misogynistic or to recognize what misogyny is. That means then that there isn't going to be a cannibalization of the movement. What's more likely going to happen isn't that women are going to say, we're more ugly, so we just can't do it, and everybody else needs to also accept we're ugly. But they're probably going to say, the idea that there is a concept of ugliness that is defined not by us, but by other people necessarily means that they're probably going to be for breaking these barriers down, right? Finally, the comparative. This is bizarre. They say we give more agency and choice and other things because feminism is agency. Yes, but you need to mechanize it. Our counterfactual on government isn't more femcels. It's trying to rehabilitate these femcels by providing them some of the things they miss in the status quo. That is, connections so that we can break that isolation. Other ways of networking and socializing so that they can go beyond the echo chambers that exist inside like subreddits and such, right? These are all things that happen exclusively on government. So what is that? How do we weigh this debate? The first is this good for the feminist movement in general? We gave you 3 broad things that opposition just doesn't contest because their contention was female pleasure, which we've already addressed. But before that, do you want to engage?
Yeah, a quick piece of engagement. You've never really explained how the support translates into actual impacts in terms of you not normalizing it, but saying that, yeah, these are issues we need to destroy and take down.
I think Nishan's speech, if you'd bothered to listen, probably mechanized those things very specifically. What did we say? The counterfactual is necessary, going to be the case that we welcome them into the general movement. We form connections in the form of acquaintanceships and friendships. We have them attend things like feminist rallies and protests. We also told you it's going to be a meeting in the middle. So the feminist movement might become more outwardly and overtly focused on things like dismantling beauty norms as a public target. So campaigning for things like female directors in things like adult movies or general movies, right? But it also looks like we just accept the problems are a reflection of patriarchy, as opposed to just a like very, very pretty woman capitalizing off of that patriarchy, which is what the femcel narrative is. That is to say, we have mechanized this and we have impacted this. You just choose to ignore it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the debate, guys. Like, just because you claim it didn't happen, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Actually, you can check the flow. Right. It is good for the movement. 3 important things. The first is we get greater numbers on our side for the feminist movement because we're able to include these femcels within like the movement itself. This is good for political capital because this means more voting support and more lobbying support in case we need to do these sort of things. The second thing we tell you is that this prioritizes the dismantling of norms above and beyond what's happening in the status quo, because necessarily including them means to give them a platform where most of their voices can be heard. In this case, these beauty norms, these ideas of the male gaze being so like paramountly important. The third thing we said is it helps shift the Overton window of the feminist movement for places where it isn't just liberals who are leading this movement, right? All of these are things that went uncontested because they just rejected our premise entirely. We're quite charitable. We've talked about their case. We've talked about why it's co-optable on our side and why in the status quo it already happens. They need to respond. The second thing we said is it's just generally good for the femcels. We give you 2 things. The first is we just give them more connections in the status beyond what the status quo offers them, right? If we give them space within the movements, they can make friends, they can talk to other people, they can have friendships that aren't just anonymous people re-echoing the same trauma responses that they faced throughout their life. We also told you their outcomes change. If we can move them off the radicalization ladder by giving them connections and giving them ways to use their frustration in more positive means, it probably means they won't be as radical. So it's better for the femcels, it's better for the movement. Please vote government.
The speaker for that speech, I invite the opposition rep to conclude the substantive part of the debate.
Hi, to confirm I'm audible loud and clear.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Trigger warning. I'm not so sure how much this requires a trigger warning, but I'm probably gonna say a fuck this, fuck that, because I'm just like frustrated in this debate, but that's gonna happen. So if anyone has problems with the fuck word, let me know. I will say something else. I'll say duck. Okay. Cool. POI is exclusively through the chat. I will take if I have the time to, otherwise, let's just hope I engage directly in my speech. Cool. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's as though that government want to be on the right side of this motion, but they're just unfortunately not. Because they want to claim a lot of the impacts, but don't necessarily show why they're more likely to happen on their side of the house. And I think this really, really strawman this debate. So I'm going to call all of these things individually, right? First thing they say, and I'm going to go in order of like what their smaller claims are, and then move on to their biggest push then, and then show why they, on the weighing out of this case, their case essentially falls flat. Firstly, they say that, hey, we're going to have all of these women sort of give them a platform and then have them have a voice to do these things. And the question they ask is, who are we going to blame, right? Because on their side and on either side, I think there's a concession that either side is going to blame societal structures for progressing these kind of narratives of what women ought to look like, whether they're pretty or ugly and who deserves sex and who fucking does it, right? Because of all of these reasons, I think either side concedes that there are structures that exist that villainize women and that portray which women get to deserve what they should be getting at the end of it all, right? The question then is, whom do they blame for this? Because even if they talk about the platform that they're going to give them, when they say they're going to take them to rallies, they say they're going to meet in the middle ground for the feminists, right? What is the giving of the platform going to look like? Because no, the burden on their side of the house is to say that you support these femcels. So you cannot at any point in time interject them and tell them that they're wrong and that their opinions are wrong. What you're necessarily then going to do is you tell them, you give them the platform, and they get to say whatever the fuck they want. What are they likely to say then? Two things. First, insofar as they argue and agree that there are structures that exist that tell them that they're probably less attractive and don't deserve that level of sexual pleasure, what they're proudly at best going to say is that we are fucking ugly and we're okay with that. So what we're going to do is just succeed to the norm and be okay with being celibate involuntarily and just not derive any sort of sexual pleasure. And we're okay if men don't care about our sexual pleasure, and we're okay if men don't give a fuck and we have to attain to male pleasure. The only thing that they don't argue here is how does any of this change? Because the only thing they say is we don't want them to become radical, so we want them to come to the middle ground. They never really say why this radicalization is more likely to end up like stopping on their side of the house, because they just assert that this middle ground exists. Because the likelihood of this middle ground is you're going to let them say all of these things and get away with it, because you never really show how you get the structural changes in terms of wanting to change media and all of these kind of things, right? Because these women have internalized that it's okay to be celibate, even though it's involuntary for you. And they've internalized the fact that it's okay to want to do these things, even though it just means that you can probably hold on to relationships. What then are the impacts that you get from side opposition? One thing, first, one is about the idea of how you largely change these structures. How does this largely happen in the mechanization that comes from side opposition? It's not true that we discard the mechanization that comes from side government. We just think that the way it manifests is not enough for the society. Because the way that it manifests is what I told you earlier about the fact that they just normalize the situation that they're in, and they're probably going to continue to be celibate. I don't know why any of these things change. So firstly, you talk about how, A, it's not okay to be involuntarily pushed into celibacy. You're probably going to still have voluntary celibates wherein people are like that identify as asexual on the spectrum, or people that just simply don't want to have sex in their kind of relationships and just not in sexual relationships, and therefore they continue to be celibate. The problem then with involuntary is that we acknowledge that these largely exist with structures, and we want to accurately call out that these shouldn't be the case. Women shouldn't have to involuntarily fucking be celibate because that's just trashy for them, and we want these structures to change. This only happens insofar as you don't support them, because what happens then? You tell them that this support is invalid. You tell them that we're not going to support such women. You would then ask the question, why are you not supporting these other women that are femcels? Because they're also women, and the feminist movement should support and include more and more women possible. You're then asked to justify why your support doesn't exist. You then argue why involuntary celibacy is problematic insofar as it validates and normalizes the involuntary structures that exist. What is the second weighing on this mechanism then? The second weighing is to do with where are you more likely to end up in better relationships and set better standards for yourself. Insofar as you concede and normalize that it's okay for women to involuntarily be celibate, if it just so means that they're going to preserve the kind of relationship that they're currently in, that means you're going to normalize the kind of relationships. You never choose to step out of a relationship that push you to be involuntary celibate instead of moving on to relationships where you can probably achieve some level of sexual pleasure and female pleasure. The third mechanism in the weighing on this as to why you're more likely to get visceral impacts in terms of two things. One, in terms of restructuring and reclaiming and redefining media narratives as to what female pleasure looks like, creating more knowledge that gives information to a lot of men around there in the world as to what this like sort of female pleasure looks like. Insofar as you increase these knowledge systems, you increase the kind of access of narratives within the media, you alter the way that this female celibacy is celebrated. We don't want involuntary female celibacy to be supported and celebrated. What we, however, want is we don't want this kind of radical change to exist. I think that's fucking trash. Second, then, I think on the weighing of this other idea of where are you more likely to get with like, where are you more likely to get organic change, right? Because that is the weighing. And I think they really make this symmetric because they don't want like judges to like be happy about the debate and want judges to scratch their heads. Because the only claim that they make is that we get all of these impacts because we try to minimize the radicalization. And this only happens when you support them. When you reject them, they go ahead and radicalize themselves. Why is this less likely to happen? When you reject them, you have to justify for reasons of rejecting the femcels and why they shouldn't have to be involuntary celibate. You acknowledge the same things that they previously hate, right? The only difference is the way you acknowledge them and what you derive out of them. Even on their side, they're probably going to acknowledge that patriarchal systems exist and they're oppressed. The question is, what is the response to this oppression? I'll take that view real quick.
The fact that they are involuntarily celibate means they don't want to be. So why is it okay to be involuntarily celibate? In your side, like it's like saying how many
it's okay to be involuntary. We are never claiming why it's okay to be involuntary celibate. You're the side that supports them and says that it's okay to be involuntary celibate and celebrates them and says that, hey, We are involuntary celibate. You acknowledge the structures they're involuntary celibate for, but you never really change it because you claim that these women get the platform, and then they're going to say that, hey, we're just ugly women that don't get sex, and that's okay. We're just going to involuntarily celibate, and that happens. The question then becomes is, where do you get this organic change, right? As I told you, 2 reasons for this organic change. Even though you move into this integration of radicalization, there's 2 reasons as to why on our side you wouldn't radicalize these women further. Because you change the interpretation of what they should be looking at these structures at. If on either side you acknowledge that there are structures that push beauty standards, that women should, like pretty women, get better sex and all these kind of things, you say that on our side, you say that, yeah, these are structures, but we don't want people to become involuntary celibates because of these reasons. We want people to acknowledge that these are structures we're willing to change, and we shouldn't have to subdue to these structures because these are things we fucking have the power to change. I think that becomes important on side of opposition, which government just claimsly asserts a narrative, but they don't necessarily prove why their impacts really stand in the overall of this debate. Couldn't be more proud to oppose.
And speak with that speech and invite the opposition to respond.
Yep. Am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Give me a few seconds and then I'll start. All right. I'll start. I'll just start a timer. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let me break the steps of analysis which government needed to do and what government actually did. Okay. So let's say both sides, and we agree with government on this, that there is societal oppression which has caused this woman to be femcels. Agreed, right? The next step is we'll give them platform. We ask why. They say that, hey, because these people will tell about their oppression and so on. Here is the missing analysis on side government's case and why they are too late to do it. Even if it's true that they feel ugly because of societal oppression, femcels need to acknowledge that it is because of societal oppression that they are ugly. So here is the linking, right? The reason why femcels would not do anything for you in terms of this support, because they will never come up and say that, hey, it is the society which has set beauty standards. On those beauty standards, we are ugly, and that is why we can't form meaningful relationships. That is not the analysis which the femcels would give you the moment you give them platform. They will just say we are ugly, and that is why we don't make meaningful relationships. And that's bad because it acknowledges that, and it allows the feminist movement to look like they're acknowledging people who believe in beauty standards, who believe that there are some people who are likely to be ugly and some people who are likely to be attractive on the similar metrics of problematic patriarchal beauty standards which that government necessarily wanted to fight for. I think that is the problem, and that is the missing analysis which necessarily takes them out of this debate from the Prime Minister itself. All right, let's come to mechanisms then. We tell you that the mechanism of this is really simple. We continue to what we are doing right now. We continue to fight our beauty standards because we create this narrative that beauty standards don't exist. We cater to a minimal liberal population and educate them that why beauty standards are bad. We force companies like Dove to ditch white actresses but rather hire black models to redefine this beauty standard. We continue to do all of this. The problem is this, that the moment you give platform to the femcels, they necessarily harm these already made efforts and they necessarily slow down the progress or rather reverse it. I think at that point of time, that's problematic. The response from side government whip to all of this mechanization is that, hey, they say something like yada, yada, yada. I think yada, yada, yada is a great response, but doesn't do enough to analyze the nuance of the mechanization we necessarily wanted to give you. But secondly, and more importantly, right, what is their mechanization? Let's look at the comparative. Here is where they stop in their mechanization. They tell you that A, we get more context, we get more contacts, we get friends, and so on. All right, so let's assume that's true, right? They don't tell you why that's likely to be true, or even if it's true, why that's likely to be exclusive to their sides, why we can't have like friends here, like femcels can be friends with other femcels, femcels can be friends with like normal people who are not feminists. I'm extremely unsure what is the exclusivity of that mechanism, but let's assume even if it is. Even if it is, I'm extremely unsure making friends or making connections can directly solve beauty standards and the ideas of female pleasure which they necessarily want to tackle with, right? They never show you the linking of why connection is directly connected for you tackling beauty standards much better in your paradigm. I think the extent of analysis is something which is an inherent problem at the whole government bench. But thirdly, and more importantly, they never ever deal with our analysis of female pleasure and why that has to be a prioritized. We tell you that we live in a world where male pleasure and what male gaze necessarily wants is prioritized because of things like porn, things like movies, things like books which are written by male people of what female ought to do, right? We think that we want to reclaim this narrative. We want to, like not okay, right? We necessarily then think that you have to reverse this narrative the moment you necessarily you disacknowledge femcels and you say that, hey, these people are feminist and we do not want involuntary celibacy because we think that female pleasure has to be prioritized. And that's when you can create those narratives. They never do that on the paradigm. But lastly, right, like, I don't know what kind of notes government is making, but we never really said why involuntary celibacy is ever okay. Like, that's the whole point of our motion, right? We don't want to support them because they think that involuntary celibacy is something which is likely to be okay. The moment we support them, we validate involuntary celibacy, and that's not something we want to do. That's Ops' claim from the first speaker itself. Extremely unsure what the comparative then becomes at Gov. Panel, the debate is really simple. Like, even if let's assume that femcels are the largest victims of oppression, of patriarchy, and so on, even if we can have some sort of sympathy for them, it is problematic for two reasons. One, because it allows more femcels to exist because of the thing which current femcels do. We think on a larger utilitarian metric, on the idea of female agency itself, an idea of principal consistency, we must make this trade-off. Could not be more proud to propose.
I can speak about that speech and have the opposition reply to the government reply to conclude the debate.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I'll start in a while. Hi, can you hear me? Femcels aren't born femcels. A lot of the time, it is their response to built of anger and frustration, the channel or like trauma from existing rejections, a lot of the ways in which they feel that frustration at the society and patriarchy. They cannot just say that the only reason why I'm not getting this kind of platform or I'm not getting this relationship is just because I'm ugly, because they have faced a lot of other reactions in reaction to this. This means that because they feel that they are ugly, they also feel that people shouldn't treat them in the way that beauty standards feel like treats them. That is why it is important to get that perspective, because only time when they look at feminist channels and turn on the discourse, they're more likely to see people who are unrelatable to them, people who haven't suffered the special disadvantage that these people have. And that is why they're difficult to change. But then we talked about where they exist. We talked about insidious channels where they are more likely to connect and form relationships. They're more likely to be anonymized, where we don't recognize their problem. Thus, we are unable to help them. In so many ways, the only conversation they have with other femcels, and this further consolidates the narratives that are likely to make them bad. At that point, I'm not exactly sure why feminist movement, for their purity of principle, should abandon the women who are most oppressed out of this. And that is opposition case, because they, at any point, no point in their case, they build a case for femcels. They build a case for people who suffer the brunt of oppression against them. They just say that let's ignore them, we'll be slightly more purer in our stance. But next thing, what do they want? And this is where the large degree of disagreement happened. Their argument here is they don't want anything from society. They are just unhappy with the way society treats them. So at a point you are unhappy with the way society treats them, they are most likely to want that kind of validation. So they are the people who want that sexual pleasure so very much because society has disadvantaged them. And in so many ways, they have harmed them. The fact that this is involuntary means that they had zero choice in doing these kind of things in regards to not opting for certain kind of relationship. The fact that they have no choice is exactly the reason why opposition is punishing them again. I'm not sure how that links again. The next important thing to note is in regards to who they are likely to blame. We talked about a few things. When we organically allow femcels to go on their own, they are more likely to go through insidious channel perpetuating hatred, but also a lot of the time they are likely to be depressed and sad. The reason for that is a lot. Like, for example, the patriarchy and society doesn't listen to them. They are the people who are most oppressed by them. But now feminists don't listen to them. In fact, they are not likely to support them in regards to the agenda or against their frustration against women, frustration against men, or probably frustration against privileged women, which is also something that I think feminist movements should discuss. They have no response to that. I think they are okay with current status quo in the way feminist movement is operating, which is again not targeting these people. We told you what is our mechanism for change. We have several mechanisms attained. A lot of these discourses, the rejections that happen in isolation, these people's conversations of their frustrations happen in isolation. We bring that to mainstream discourse. We make people aware of the issues and the problems that these people are facing. So we are able to inbuild them as one intersection of feminist movement. We are able to prioritize their needs and concerns as well. This also engages with other situations in which feminist movement has been bad. For example, not being relatable to this kind of people who are most likely prioritizing third world feminism instead of the issues that other people are facing. So we are likely to challenge this kind of issues. The second thing is we give them space for conversation, space for venting themselves out, where we give them recognition and we prevent further radicalization, because they don't have to go out in insidious channels to build up their anger and frustration and go out and probably make more people femcels as well. Next important thing to note here is we also said that even in instances where these people bring this unique radical point of view where they don't want anything altogether, I think this is also forcing the society to engage at the larger level. When you say that society has oppressed me so very much, and I think Abbas did point out the fact about the info slide, the fact is you cannot unsee the oppression because that is what they face every single day. The fact is they are just okay with it because they see no way out. We give them a way out. They don't, on their side, they are very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. And now the speakers for a fine debate. Speakers can virtually cross the floor to shake hands and then return to the main hall where the decision will be announced.